Hello and welcome back to Rose Coloured Glasses with RK. I am RK, Rachael Karlyl, and I am your host. This is episode 2, and I want to tell you the story of why my friend Ollie over at the Ollie and Tille Meets podcast called me the Queen of Pivot. She's like, you just seem to be able to, switch a direction when you need to. So I had just unpacked that a little bit, had a little bit of a think, and I agree, Ollie. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through all of the times that I had to pivot. And this is really why this podcast has been born, is that the joy, the adventure, the pleasure of the pivot, to the confidence to do it, to give it a crack and to hope it's all going to work out. So let's start. So we're going to start way back when I was 12 years old, and I'm almost 40 in about 2 months. So whenever that was, about 28 years ago. So I was 12 when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, and that meant that I jumped into legal studies and did all the things that I was supposed to do at school. Now, I had this illusion until I looked at some of my report cards yesterday, because for some reason I still have them. And I saw that some of my marks were potentially not as good as I expected them to be. In any case, I graduated grade 12 and I ended up with an OP of 12, which is actually an OP, for all the people that have no idea what I'm talking about, is essentially the magical grade thing that allows you to get into university in Queensland. I believe it's called an ATAR or something now. So I got a 12, and obviously had 12-year-old me being like, damn it, you should have got higher, so you could have got straight into law school. So I did not get straight into law school, and I actually met some of the most beautiful humans I had ever met in that year, going to university doing a Bachelor of Leisure Management. Yes, folks, you heard that, Bachelor of Leisure Management. So essentially, as a Bachelor of Arts, then I chose leisure management. I can't even say it anymore because it seemed like a bit of fun. Essentially, it was hospitality, it was sports management. It was kind of a bit of a mismatch of all the things, like most arts degrees are, I think, or at least the ones that were around when I was at uni. So for 12 months, I did a Bachelor of Leisure Management, and one of the assignments I had to do in that was actually ran a yoga class for my cohort of students. So the cohort of students that I was in. So that was pretty cool. So I got to the end of law school, or what I thought was the end of law school, 4th year, and I don't know who had to pivot at this point, and realised that we also had to do practical legal training. What? And, like most law students, they're like, what the hell? I'm actually so smart already. I don't need any more diplomas or anything like that. Yeah. So to get your practicing certificate in Queensland and Australia, you need to do practical legal training, which essentially requires you to do essentially as it sounds, some practical legal training before they let you go out into the world and be a lawyer. Probably a good thing in hindsight. I mean, at the time, it was a bit of a shock. And then finish law school, finish my PLT, and I could not get a job. I know that law students even these days are still struggling. There's a lot of people that graduate with a law degree in Australia, and unfortunately there's not usually enough jobs to support all of those people once they graduate. So I could not get a job. So my next pivot, I went on, actually got Centrelink for the first time in my life, I think for a period of about 6 weeks. And I asked them to essentially put me through another course, and that course was making coffee. So I essentially learned how to make cappuccinos and lattes and all those fun things. And that was back in, 2010, I think that was. 2009 it would have been. Anyway, but I kept applying for jobs and kept on trying to get work experience, kept on, pursuing that dream of lawland and being a lawyer, but continuing to pivot as, life was happening around me, or to me, with me in it. Then I started working for a barrister. So I really enjoyed immigration law at university, and I was interested in criminal law. I had a boss, my first boss actually in lawland, that was a criminal lawyer, and I really enjoyed the work, although the work that he did was a bit much for my liking. So the barrister that I ended up working for actually did a mix of criminal law and migration law. So I thought of sort of hit the jackpot on that. So I learned a lot about migration. I learned a lot about criminal law. And then I needed to get admitted. So the next step in lawland progression is that essentially you go and get admitted as a lawyer. And so naturally I asked my boss to be the person that moved my admission. Did all the paperwork. Again, for all the law students out there and for the almost lawyers out there, you're well aware of what this process is and how stressful it is. I remember putting my forms forward to the court and freaking out that potentially they weren't going to let me get admitted as a lawyer because I had a fine on my record, and that fine actually I had 2 fines, one for each foot. I got fined for putting my feet on the seat on the train at some point during university, and I was freaking out that I wasn't going to get admitted. Turns out that's not a big deal. And then 2 weeks before I got admitted, and mind you, this paperwork goes in like months before, the barrister that I was working for was charged with sexual harassment. Made the decision that I didn't want him to move my admission anymore, because if that was something that was made out and proven, that he potentially wouldn't be the best person to be moving my admission. So I had to go out 2 weeks before I had my admission and find someone, I guess, that would be willing to do it. Now, it is quite the honour to move someone's admission, but as the first person in my family to go to university, first lawyer and eldest daughter, and we'll get to that in future episodes, I didn't really have any connections in lawland apart from the places that I'd done a little bit of work experience. And I did remember asking one of the lawyers there, and he was like, Rachel, I would love to do that for you, but I don't go to court and I have no confidence to do that. So I ended up with a barrister that I cannot remember his name. And so I had to pivot again. Pivot. I ended up then working in a small law firm, but in the meantime, I'd always had my eye on this big firm. So big international immigration law firm, which was essentially my first and really only big lawland job. So January 2020, I pivoted again. So I got my first big lawland city job. Was very excited to get on the bus and go all the way into the city instead of going to a suburban practice. And I started. So 3 months in, I went on my first refugee task force. So essentially what that means is that I go away for a couple of weeks, lodge a bunch of visa applications for refugees that are currently in immigration detention, and then sit with them for their interviews with the Department of Home Affairs. And then essentially wait, but then come back home, wait for a decision. So that was a very, very cool experience. And I realized that maybe that was something that I really wanted to do more of. But the problem was the team that ran those types of jobs was in Sydney. And so 9 months into my big lawland job, I moved to Sydney and I worked in the litigation and review team for 9 months. And then 9 months later, I met a boy and moved back to Brisbane, despite my senior associate at the time telling me to never make a decision for a boy. Then 2 years later, pivoted again, moved back down to New South Wales for my ex to start a business. And I ended up working remote back in 2015 before remote working was cool and before the big C word hit the world. 2017, I was married for the first time and did the whole shebang, all the bells and whistles. And then a few months later, after kind of making a decision that New South Wales potentially was not the right place, moved back to Queensland and went back into my old job. So I'd worked in a few little small firms since then, bits and pieces here and there of different practices, different jobs, learning lots of different skills, which was very cool. But then coming back to Queensland, I wanted a little bit of consistency, I guess solidarity in work, confidence in my income, all those things. And so I went back to my old job, and this was the big lawland job that I had, which started out as something that was really amazing. I got some really amazing opportunities. There was some really great leaders in that business at different points throughout my career. But coming back to my old job and the way that the business was at that point, and this was, I think, end of 2017, I then started down my burnout pathway. And I think within the next sort of 12 months, I realized that maybe lawland wasn't for me. And so I started my master's, so my MBA. So my big pivot here was like, oh, maybe this far into my career, maybe I'm done. Maybe I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. Spoiler alert for everyone listening that already knows my story. I still am a lawyer. And that was a long time ago that I decided I didn't want to be anymore. So here we are. So in my first trimester doing my MBA, I applied to go to Scotland to do the European School of Advanced Management at the University of Glasgow. Now, I'd never been to Scotland before, and I think traditionally the people that did this program were towards the end of their MBA, but, me being me, I decided that I was going to run away to Scotland, and that was a life-changing trip. I stayed at the Dumfries campus of University of Glasgow, and for anyone that doesn't know where Dumfries is, I don't think anyone really does. It's somewhere between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I had a 2-week complete life-changing adventure in Scotland, and it was amazing. I learned, I was living on a Harry Potter campus. I started my obsession with Highland cows because they were everywhere and it was beautiful. And so that 2 weeks really changed my life. The reason why I guess this pivot had to happen was that I had to break the cycle. I was doing the same thing day in, day out, working sort of 14, 15, 16-hour days. And by this stage, I had full-blown burnout. I couldn't really manage my emotions. I was all over the shop, up, down, uppers in the morning, so coffee in the morning, alcohol at night to go to sleep, and struggling to manage emotions, which was really, really difficult. So had this amazing Harry Potter, whimsical, refinding myself kind of experience in Scotland. Then I had to come back to work. So back to reality. So my disassociated self had to put myself back together again and come back into the reality that was work. And I walked back into the office. And so I think it took me about 2 hours to get from downstairs in the office up to my desk. And I walked into the office and I had 997 emails. I had 6 people sending me handover notes that were looking after my work. And I was just done. In that moment, I just realized that I was out. I was done. I couldn't do this anymore. I went for a 2-hour coffee break at about 10 a.m. So I'd been at work for about an hour and a half. Came back and sent a resignation email to the managing partner of Asia Pac and essentially outlined all the reasons, all manner of things about the firm, about the culture, about the way we have to work, the expectation, the lack of development, the lack of forward thinking, the lack of pathway, all of these things. And I put that forward to this person. And then I was called into essentially a meeting to have a conversation and was told, I can't really imagine that it was actually like that, Rachel, which was, I guess, solidified my decision to stop. So then I worked out a 2-month and 2-day notice period. So the 2 days was tacked on to the end because I took 2 days of leave during that time. And so they required me to work those additional 2 days at the tail end. And I realized at this point that I had to pivot. I had to do something different. This was not me anymore. I wasn't interested in working at this level. I wasn't interested in doing, I guess, this loveless kind of job, this role. So I started working for a friend of a friend of a friend as a casual lawyer. And I had a waterfront place office. I had a review. And this is where I had that moment from episode 1 where I said there was a bit of a moment of clarity where I was like, is this it? Aren't I supposed to be happy now? I've got technically, what I'm supposed to get out of Lawland, but surely there's more than this. So about 9 months later, so I worked in that, stayed in that role, despite my moments of clarity. And about 9 months later, I essentially got fired for being too senior. So, and that sounds very facetious, but essentially the reason was that, the practice wasn't making as much money as we probably could have. And the high level of salary output, given the seniority in the team, essentially meant that I was the one to go. So I still remember walking out of the building and I walked down not Queen Street, I think, anyway, Edward Street maybe, and essentially took myself off to the movies, ordered some popcorn and a beer and thought, okay, this is really it. Now I need to actually pivot and consider what I actually want out of my life story and figure out what's next. And it can't be more of the same. So I took 3 months off work and I was coming to the tail end of my MBA. Took 3 months off work, went and volunteered at the Innocence Project at Griffith, Gold Coast, love Griffith. And I started to kind of reconnect with my passion for law. I also started to undertake some work experience for some management consulting firms because that is what I thought I wanted to be when I grew up. And I just took 3 months to learn and reconnect. I also went to New York City for Christmas that year and graduated from my MBA. So it was a big, really big few months. During that 3 months, definitely swore off being a lawyer. And then a few months later, I got a job essentially managing a migration business, let's call it that. And I was due to start in the end of February 2020. And I guess we all know what happened in 2020. But for me, it was kind of a, multi-layered trauma of 2020, let's call it that. 2 days before I was supposed to start my new big job as managing, I think, 9 people in this migration business. So essentially a law firm, but I'm not going to call it that because that's not what it was. And my ex, now husband, essentially sat me down and said, hey, just so you know, your best friend, and I had a baby and that baby is 2 years old and I'm running away to be with her. And so that was a moment of clarity, a moment of pivot where I thought, okay, what am I going to do here? Like that was a bit of a bombshell. So I had the breakup. 2 days later, started the job. And then 6 weeks later, we went into COVID lockdowns. All the while, my home life was falling apart. I was essentially moving him out of the house, all of those things. And, working through 2 of the biggest relationship breakdowns I've ever had in my life. Then August 2020 comes along and I was just a bit done, as most people can imagine. I was working in migration law, and as you can kind of imagine, migration law was at an all-time controversial high in Australia, all of those things. And it was a really, really, really stressful area to be working in. I had lots of young humans that were working for me, and they were all superstars, but they were getting really burnt out as well. And I was really trying to give them as much energy as I possibly could, but I wasn't really looking after myself at all. August 2020, I started a general manager role at a place called the NGO Training Centre, which is founded by a friend of mine. And we essentially started to create a business from the ground up. So at that point, this is August 2020, this is pre them being as amazing and huge as they are now. And we literally had those dining table discussions of what a process should look like and the type of people we should employ and how the sales process looks and all of those amazing things. So I helped build her business up from the 2 people, that was me and her, up to I think 12 people or 10 people in 12 months. And so I essentially ended up being somewhat of a sales manager, which was pretty cool, and starting to help bring in clients and I guess really shape the foundation of the way that the business, looks today. And that was cool. I got to contribute. But what that sort of taught me as well was that if I can do this for someone else, maybe I can do this for myself. And I made the decision about 12 months later again to to leave the business that I was in and to start my own law firm. Now, obviously, this whole trajectory of me not wanting to be a lawyer anymore and having burnout in migration law, and we were still in COVID and borders were still closed, and I opened a business called Passage Migration Consulting. And Passage Migration Consulting was a immigration-focused law firm that essentially would support people to come into Australia, including individual humans, and also support businesses to be able to find and hire overseas staff. And I would support people to do those things. And it was really, I think, looking back, the other reason why I started this business is, hey, I could probably do that. And I know migration law, so that seems like the safest bet. And people around me had started starting their own sort of law businesses as well. And I thought, well, why can't I do that too? And I think as well, I had this fear inside of me that if I wanted to go back to the legal industry at any point, because my burnout was so significant, and I think I had a bit of PTSD, to be honest, and this is all undiagnosed, but this is, me saying this, that I had this belief that I had to be the one to create a workplace that I wanted to work in. And that's what I did. And about 2 years later, that business was very quickly becoming a thing that I didn't want to work in anymore. I wasn't growing in the way that I thought I would. I wasn't responsibly managing money, and I just wasn't doing it. It's easy for me to say in hindsight all the things I wasn't doing. I was helping people. I was supporting my clients. I was going out to see my clients. I actually traveled with one of my clients over to the UK. And I think that my heart wasn't 100% in it all the time. And so even though I had some beautiful humans and my heart was 100% in making sure that whatever happened for them in their next stage of life, so their visa application, whatever that was going to lead them to and get them to, whatever happened for them, I was so invested in, and I loved being able to support people in that way. But my heart wasn't in kind of running the business, that type of business. And at this point as well, I should have said as well, November 2020 was another pivot. I met my now husband, and on the 11th of the 11th, 2022, I married my now husband, and in, I believe, March of 2023, we started renovating our first house. So this was all big changes, big pivots. All of these things that I've just talked about changed literally the direction of my life and the way in which I would do things. So in the middle of renovating a house, my desk had moved probably 100 times around the house while I was trying to run the business. And I got to a point where I was like, I'm done. This is so untenable. And I realized that I actually love renovating, and it was so cool. And that perhaps the consistency of income would actually contribute into the renovation side of things, as opposed to having to run a business and do all the things and be all the things. I started looking for work, and I ended up in a government role, which I still am in now, and being able to build a team and have hard conversations and talk to people and infiltrate the system with ideas of well-being and happiness and joy in lawland, and giving people space and clarity and the ability to have hard conversations. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm going to change lawland, but I do believe that I'm more confident in having conversations. So I don't want people to have to go through the things that I went through. And so I'm infiltrating the way in which we do things in lawland, the way in which we show up, the way in which we stand up for ourselves, the way in which we be great lawyers and also great humans. And so that's my current mission at work, as well as doing some really cool things. And then the new biggest pivot for me is so the first house we renovated, we bought and sold and made a profit, and then bought a new house, and we're currently in the almost tail end of the renovation on that one. And it is absolutely cracker. So the joy that you get from renovating a house, I don't know if anyone's ever done it or people think it's terrifying, is absolutely amazing. It is to see things kind of come to life and then be able to start decorating your own way and I guess vacuuming your own carpet, cleaning your own windows and doing all the things that are yours. Swimming in your own pool, gardening your own gardens. It's just such an amazing joy to have that. And it's so much so great. My husband is actually finished up at work, which is amazing. So that's another pivot in our lives. And I'm continuing to work, and my current pivot, or more creative pivot this time, is starting this podcast and creating stickers and having my own brand, which is RK, that essentially allows me to have conversations with people and bring joy and the magic of the pivot and all of these things to life in a real live way. And I'm really excited about, I guess, what this new chapter of my life is. And I'm really excited about what new pivots look like. We've just come back from a holiday in Thailand, and one of the pivots we talked about was, potentially buying a business and moving to Spain. So you never know what could happen. Obviously, these are all potentials. And I'm still here, still doing this, but I am so excited to share these pivots with you and I guess show that nothing is a straight line. Your career is not linear. Your life is not linear. It's not, despite what you're told in the early days of your career, particularly when you're at university doing some sort of professional services type thing. You get your degree, you do the thing, you buy a house, you pay it off, you have kids, you maybe make partner, and then, you work, you go on a few cool holidays, and then you're dead. And I'm just not interested in that path anymore. I know that there's something bigger and better out there. And I'm so excited to be able to share that with other people. So I really hope that you've got something out of this today. If anything, you might have got the craziness of what my life has been over the last, what my life has been and the crazy decisions that we make and how we've kind of got here. But the power of pivoting and being cool with it and being able to kind of confidently go in the direction of uncertainty, I think is one of the big lessons that I've learned. And some days I freaking hate uncertainty, to be honest. And I really don't want that. And what I want to do is, go to work, show up, do the things, do the same thing, come home, know what I'm going to eat, know what all the people are going to do, know what's happening, all of those things. And then I realized that's probably not actually me. That's today's episode. Episode 2, the pivot, the confidence to go in the direction of instability. Terrifying, but amazing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I cannot wait to start sharing my amazing guests with you, all that I know have had a cool pivot in their lives. This is going to be amazing. If you love the content, please like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. I am going to be doing a giveaway of some of my newest designs of my cool stickers for the first 20 subscribers. So I will be putting that out on my social media, and I will leave a link to my Instagram in the show notes. Have an amazing day.